Well, hey everyone, this week's episode of The Vinyl Guide is brought to you in part by AudiofileUSA.com, the used record website that only sells excellent and near-mint vinyl records. AudiofileUSA.com sells only the best condition records, some still sealed from decades in storage. These are your final upgrades, people. Go to AudiofileUSA.com, browse by label, genre, artist, dig deep, and find those deals. That's AudiofileUSA.com. Well, hey everyone, it's Nate here. Welcome to this week's episode of The Vinyl Guide. This week we are honored to have as our guest Mr. Bruce Licher of Independent Project Records. Now, Bruce is an extreme innovator in the field of vinyl records, collecting, and cover art. The records that he made are incredibly unique, leveraging his talent in operating printing presses and creativity in design. Bruce was a member of the post-punk band Savage Republic. However, he not only made the music, but designed and hand-printed much of the packaging, which led him to bring on other bands onto his label, Independent Project Records. The IPR label then gained widespread notoriety for their presentation of music, garnering design and manufacturing work from other labels and earning Bruce a few Grammy nominations along the way. The story of Independent Project Records is absolutely fascinating and featured in the beautiful new book, Savage Impressions, an aesthetic expedition through the archives of Independent Project Records and Press, available at ipparchive.com, and a new vinyl compilation from Independent Project Records called Tape Excavation is available at independentprojectrecords.bandcamp.com. Now, this week's episode of The Vinyl Guide is brought to you in part by GrooveWasher.com, the best vinyl record cleaner ever invented by human beings. Now, you spend a lot of money on records, keep them clean and sounding their best with the Groove Washer. Don't trust a no-name brand with your precious vinyl. Ask for the Groove Washer by name at your local record shop, or go to GrooveWasher.com and use promo code VINYLGUIDE10 at checkout. We are talking about your records, man. Don't take any chances. Let the Groove Washer bring out the music. That's GrooveWasher.com, promo code VINYLGUIDE10. Now let's kick into this week's conversation with Bruce Licher of Independent Project Records. This week on The Vinyl Guide, we are welcoming guest Bruce Licher, who you may know from Independent Project Records, from Savage Republic, even from Independent Project Press, and quite an impressive history when it comes to vinyl records and art itself. Bruce, how are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
No worries. I got my coffee. I'm ready to talk records. How about yourself?
Okay. Sounds good to me.
I guess the first, just being somewhat familiar with your work and reading that latest book, Savage Impressions, I guess my first question is, what weighs more, your letterpress machine or your record collection?
That's a very good question. I would have to say the record collection.
Oh. Okay, because that letterpress machine is not light by any stance. So,
well, yeah, that's true. And actually, we have 3 letterpress machines. So now the largest one, maybe that's more heavy than the record collection. But having had to move that record collection a few times in recent years, it's definitely up there.
I guess when it comes time for you to move, thankfully that's not that often, but I guess your friends are nowhere to be seen because they know you're going to ask for help. Is that
pretty much? Yeah.
How do you move those letterpress machines?
With forklifts and a lot of care. You need to hire people who know how to drive forklifts and how to strap presses onto them, because we did have a tumble during one of our moves of the print shop, and fortunately, we were able to get that press fixed and back up to being functional, but it was quite shocking to watch a letterpress roll off of the the forklift and onto the ground.
Oh my God. Like, how far did it go? Was it a couple feet, or was it,
Just a couple feet. I mean, it wasn't that far up off the ground, but I was walking along beside it. And of course, my first thought was, oh, well, save that press from falling over. And then I suddenly realized, no, just get out of the way.
You're powerless to gravity.
No, yeah. No, they're pretty heavy.
Got it. And your record collection, obviously that's a little bit easier to move and put in boxes. Is this something you've been building over the years? You've had most of your life? Describe your record collection.
Yeah, I mean, basically, since I was in junior high school, I started collecting records. I missed the 60s. I was 13 when I first started listening to pop radio in 1970. And so it's been fun for me to over the years to kind of go back and discover a lot of interesting and obscure music from before I started listening. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, basically it's just been something that I've accumulated over the years. I love records as artifacts, and the fact that you can play them and get emotionally connected to the creativity and the grooves. That's just a bonus for me.
Was that something that came a bit later after you started making records as art, or did music start before the art?
Oh, music started before the art, definitely. Yeah, actually, it's funny. I was just listening to an old box set of Spike Jones this morning, and that was my introduction to music and records, was my dad's old Spike Jones 78s that he had on a shelf in the back hall of the house when I was growing up. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, and I just fell in love with those records. So that started me.
and those were your dad's records. What records became your start? The genesis wasn't his record collection.
Well, when I started listening to pop radio in 1970 as a preteen, it was, it was Bobby Sherman, and the kind of bubblegum pop stuff was the first music that I was attracted to. And then I had an older brother that kind of got into things sooner than I did in terms of hard rock and space rock and progressive rock and things like that. So when he went off to college, I ended up with part of his record collection, and that kind of got me into bands like Hawkwind and I'm on Duel 2 and Pink Floyd and that sort of thing. And then when I went to college was when the whole punk rock thing started, and that got me going in that direction.
So that's interesting, because you bring up bands like Hawkwind and Pink Floyd, who have very strong iconography and visual roots.
Definitely.
And then into punk rock. So I imagine that those early records really made an impression on you as you were starting to get into art school. Absolutely, yeah. And I still have a bunch of those albums that I got from my brother when I was 15, 16 years old, and still listen to them. They're great. You got the original ones, the ones that he handed down to you. Bruce, you're going to need these. Okay. Yeah. Very cool. So in your, and again, I want to highly recommend people check out this book, Savage Impressions, because it really spells out the history of the label Independent Project Records, and of course your artistic history. Yeah. And it really tells a very interesting story. Now, the first record that you produced, manufactured, let's say, was an art school project, Project 197. Is that right? That's correct. Yeah. I had been taking a conceptual art class by a fairly well-known conceptual artist, Chris Burden, who had started teaching at UCLA in the late 1970s. And I ended up meeting a few people in that class that I started playing music with, the first music that I ever started doing on my own. Mm-hmm. And that was a group called Neef, Neef. And we had some friends that had put out their own record. They had a punk group called the Urinals on campus. And so we thought, oh, wow, that was easy for them to put a record out. We should do a record too. So there were 5 of us in the band. We all put in $40, and we pressed as many records as we could get for $200. So we got, I think it was 163 7 inches back, made Xeroxed covers and put them out in the
got them into a few local stores and thought, wow, this is fun. I want to do another one. And so in my last year at UCLA, they had what was called an independent project course where the student could design their own course over the semester and find an instructor who would be their guide on it. And so I chose to make a record as an art project. And Chris Burden was my faculty advisor on that project.
Okay. And that was Project 197.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there were approximately 350 pressed up. Is that right?
Yes. I think I did 2 pressings of it. The first pressing was 300, and I was in a silkscreen printing class at the time, and I decided to silkscreen print the labels on the record. So I actually had the records pressed with no paper labels on them. It was just the flat plastic. And then while the record was inside the white inner sleeve that has the die cut hole in the middle, I silkscreened a picture across the label area. So where the picture was on the white inner sleeve, it was a positive image. And when it went to the black label area, it turned into a negative image and back. So that was kind of from the beginning, I was always looking to experiment and try new things and say, wow, what would happen if I did this? Mm-hmm. My goal was basically to make records as fine art. I was a fine art student, but I wasn't really attracted to, going the gallery route with paintings or drawings or whatever. I wanted to be able to create art that people could find out in the wild. And I'd be flipping through the bins at the record store and pull this out and go, wow, what is this? Where did this come from?
Now, with that sort of treatment, it's very, very special, very unique. Were you concerned that people would see it, I guess, as an artistic investment and wouldn't actually play the record?
Didn't think too much about that. It was more that I just wanted to create something unique that would stand out. And when people chose to buy it, they would feel like they had something more than just any other record that they could find in the stores.
Okay. Yeah, because I know that there's there are collectible records now, not that you were thinking that way then, but collectible records now that people buy and then they never play. They just put away or they bring it out and they look at it. You wanted people to interact with the record, to actually play it and appreciate the package. Now, and it's really interesting the way you've silk screened across the label and the little white paper sleeve. That actually became a bit of a palette as well, something that was traditionally ignored up to that point, yeah? Yeah. And, each record that I would do after that, I tried to come up with something that was unique, that wasn't really being done otherwise. Like the second 7-inch single that I put out on my label was called Bridge. And it was recorded underneath a bridge that was part of a series of subterranean utility tunnels at UCLA that I had gotten access to make a student film in. And a friend of mine and I took our guitars and amps down in this area and just basically recorded a bunch of music on a boombox. So when it came time to release that, I actually was able to get a blueprint of one of the tunnels that we were in and make a copy of it. And then my friend's dad had a blueprint machine at his office. So we went in and we actually created blueprint inserts for the record. So that was fun. I get the impression that a lot of the independent project records from the very beginning, there was a lot of DIY. There was a lot of sitting in someone's living room with the TV on, just packing these things together.
Yeah. And when the first Savage Republic album came out, we had, I think, 5 inserts that we put in there, and some of them were hand painted. And so, the whole band kind of sat around in my parents' living room and just playing with these inserts and stuffing records. And so, serious DIY.
Now, going to Savage Republic, you're talking Tragic Figures. That album. I've got a copy of that. What I thought was really interesting is that each one of them is numbered. There was 1,000, but you not only numbered the the sleeve, but also the inner sleeve. All the inserts had the same unique number. So,
Yep.
for instance, I have like 523, and all the different inserts have that number 523, so you can track them.
Yeah, there was some serious DIY sweat labor into that project.
I mean, that's really got to take a lot of forethought and planning and commitment to that level of unification of all the elements to be able to spend the time on that output.
Yeah. Well, again, it was my art. And even though there were other band members that were involved in this, it became my art project. And so I thought, well, if I'm really going to do this right, you have to go all the way.
Right.
So number all those inserts.
As you were doing it, did you ever say to yourself, why am I doing this?
Well, later on, the first time you do it, it's exciting, but by the time you get into the 4th or 5th edition and you're numbering things, it's like, okay, don't we have a mechanical numbering machine we can stick on the printing press now? So, yeah.
With that first album, Savage Republic had just changed its name from Africa Core, I believe.
Yes.
What were all the you had to update those elements because you had a lot of those inserts already made with the old band name. Is that right?
Yes. And I had just recently been learning the art of letterpress. So the main insert in that album was all handset type, which literally took like half a day to set all that type up. Each letter was an individual piece of cast lead type. And I had printed 1,000 of these, and then I had redistributed all the type back to the drawers that it came from. So that when we decided to change the name of the band a couple of weeks before the album was released, and I already had these inserts printed, I couldn't just print more of them because I'd put all the type away. I didn't want to spend another day setting the type again. So I kind of got inspired by some things from my stamp collection, which is when a country declared its independence from the colonial power, they would take the stamps that were in their existence and they would block out the old name and overprint the new name. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do that with these inserts. So I just took those inserts and set it up so that I was blocking out the name Africa Core, and then we added Savage Republic at the bottom.
When you changed the name to Savage Republic, obviously you just touched on it. There's the tendency to think of it as a country, as a change in regime.
Yeah.
And then that started fueling some future activity that you did around the stamps and some of the way that you had the basic communications. Was that envisioned early on? Like the name Savage Republic would then unlock this potential in all these other areas?
No, there wasn't any preconceived idea about that. It was just, we realized that we needed a new name because there were some issues with the original name. We were getting some people coming to our shows thinking we were neo-Nazis because of the original Africa Corps back in North Africa during World War II. Even though we didn't spell it with K's, we'd still get people coming up to us and
making assumptions.
Exactly. And so finally we just decided, you know what? This name is limiting us. We also knew that there was another band that had called themselves Africa Corps earlier in the 70s that had released a couple of albums. So we just thought, well, let's create a unique name, and we spent a couple of days brainstorming and came up with Savage Republic. And then once we kind of got into it and were doing shows and releasing records, I was having access to a printing press. I started thinking, oh, there's more we can do with this. This is interesting.
And how long before Tragic Figures? Because I think that was 1982.
Yeah.
How long was the band together before that? Were you already playing as Africa Corps, or at least the basics of Savage Republic when you were doing the Project 197?
No. Project 197 was in early 1980. And the first rehearsals with Africa Corps, what became Africa Corps, was, I believe, early 1981. So we were around and playing shows for about a year before we released the album and changed the name of the band.
And then I guess your artistic drive with the project and letterpress activity, you started making a lot of the related ephemera, the tickets, the announcements, those sort of things. That seems to be part of the whole bundle, the whole experience. What drove you to do that? I mean, were people expressing and commenting on the package, sometimes even more than the music?
Well, yeah, I mean, people loved the package of that first album. And, prior to that album, when we would do shows, I would do a Xerox flyer like most people would do. Mm-hmm. I tried to make them a little more artistic, and there's some examples of some of those in the book. But once I got my hands on the letterpress, I started thinking, well, let's do something different for our shows. Instead of making a Xerox flyer, I'll letterpress print a postcard. And that would be something that would stand out a little bit more. It was also cheaper to mail a postcard than it was to mail a flyer. If you had, we started building a mailing list. And so I thought, well, that's a way we can save some money, is print postcards. So that kind of became a whole thing. And then, I mean, once you have your hands on a printing press and you realize you can do all sorts of stuff. I was making letterheads and envelopes, and then I got into the stamps and et cetera, et cetera. So back in those pre-internet days, we put a reply card in every album that we released. And so we started getting people sending us their information so they could get on our mailing list. So, and I still have a couple of boxes of those reply cards that people sent back to us. Pretty entertaining sometimes.
After reading the book, I get the impression that you don't throw a whole lot of stuff away.
No, but I am doing my best to thin it down to just the essential stuff at this point. So
no, it's good because you had all those things, all those items to be able to take pictures of for the book and share those. So it definitely comes in handy. When did you realize the importance of iconography and brand? You seem to have been doing that really well from the get-go.
Well, the interesting thing is that most people, when they think about creating a brand, they create something that's kind of solid, that doesn't evolve. And for me, because I was standing there at a printing press, hand feeding each piece of paper in, every time I needed to make myself, if I ran out of envelopes or letterhead or business cards or anything, if I needed to print more, I'm like, well, I don't want to do the same thing I've done before. I'll design a new one. So in a sense, my brand was always evolving in terms of its aesthetic, or in terms of what the designs were. The aesthetic was still pretty similar all the way through. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I was, it's funny. A lot of what I've done, there's not a lot of pre-thought to it. It's just like, oh, let's keep myself interested. Let's do this because I think it'll be fun or it'll be interesting. Mm-hmm. So
it would seem you approached everything with an eye to the art and the aesthetic, even mundane office supplies and logistical items. Was there anything that you attempted to approach or wanted to approach differently that you weren't able to?
Yeah, there was a period of time where I was trying to print my own checks on brown craft paper so that all of my, if I wrote a check to somebody for a payment, it would be a special independent project check. And, I even went and bought a can of the magnetic ink and the
maybe they wouldn't cash it.
The font and well, that was, that occurred to me. Yeah. I mean, people might not want to cash these checks, but unfortunately, even though I tried to do everything right, the bank just finally, I took them a sample and they just said, no, we can't do this. You can't do this. So.
Okay.
That was a bit of a disappointment.
And when you took these records to dealers, how did you sell the records? I mean, you took them to record shops, to shows. I mean, how widely distributed were they within independent record shops?
Well, the first singles before the Savage Republic album came out, I did take them around to some of the local record shops in the Los Angeles area. It was exciting. Tower Records on Sunset Boulevard took some copies of Project 197, and I could walk in there and, hey, there's my record on the rack. That was pretty fun. But I would, you kind of would start to get clued in by buying music magazines, and you'd send out some promo copies to get reviewed. And once you started getting reviewed, then people would, I started getting inquiries from a couple of independent distributors saying, hey, I'd like to buy, 20 copies or whatever. But then when the first Savage Republic album came out, we pressed 1,000, and I was already selling to 3 or 4 different independent distributors at that point. And so they all took 50 to 100 copies. But then one distributor came back to me almost immediately and said, we want to buy the entire rest of the pressing. So that kind of kicked it into gear. And then all of a sudden I started getting reorders from other distributors, and I didn't have any records anymore. So we had to immediately go into a second pressing of the album. So it just kind of grew from there. It's you just try to kind of plug into the existing system, and we started getting overseas distributors interested in buying copies, and then eventually other overseas record labels asking if they could license the album for release.
Mm-hmm. Did you allow anyone to license it, or did you want to have them all manufactured? Okay, you did. Okay.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, early on in this whole process, when I was starting to create my own music and do my record label, I would always be going into the record stores and buying interesting punk and post-punk records. And I got very inspired by a French label called Sordide Sentimental, run by a fellow named Jean-Pierre Turmel. And he was doing these limited edition 7-inch singles in oversized folders with graphics. And he would do all of these speculative texts that were in French and English. And I mean, he released, I first saw his releases because he did an early Joy Division and a Throbbing Gristle and a Durutti Column singles. And I started picking those up and just thinking, wow, this is really an interesting way to package and release music. And I ended up being inspired to do a release that was similar in an oversized, it was a 7-inch single of some industrial noise soundtracks to some of my student films. And I did them, release that in an oversized package with the silkscreen labels on it. So I was very inspired by what he was doing. And when the Savage Republic album came out, I just thought, well, I'm going to send him a copy of the album because I really respect what he's doing and I want to share what I'm doing with him. And, maybe a month later, I get a letter back from France and he says, wow, this is an amazing record. I would love to release this here in France and have it be the first album on my record label. And of course, I was just thrilled. And so, yes, of course, we let him release it. And he hired somebody to do some really bizarre artwork for it, but it was very interesting. And that really, I think the fact that we licensed it to him really kicked it off for us in Europe and gained us a huge following because he already had a following for his label. So in a way, it's kind of like connecting with like-minded people who in different parts of the world who are doing similar things, but, in their own way. That sort of became the way to expand what we were doing and expand our audience.
So as the record became more popular, Tragic Figures became more popular, you had to do a third press, a fourth press, and in each one of those, it seems you made changes that made each one of them unique and special and different.
Yeah. Again, the reason for that, the main first reason was that again, here I was standing at a printing press for days on end, feeding paper through the press. And I kept thinking, well, if I have to do this again, I want to keep it interesting for myself. So I'm going to try switching the colors around, or I'm going to move these elements, like the back cover, the Film Noir single that Savage Republic released in 1983. We went through into 4 pressings of that. And each time we did it, not only did I change the colors, but the back cover was made up of all of these little elements and different typeset blocks that you could move around. You could rearrange them in different ways. You could retypeset the label name in a different font and that sort of thing. And it was the artist in me just wanting to keep it interesting for myself. What else can I do? How can I make this better?
Right.
And sometimes I'll think I want to make it better, and I end up doing something that's worse than what I did before. But again, it was this sort of sense of experimentation. I want to try something new.
At any point, did it get exhausting? Like you wanted to, you were a musician, you're part of this band, and you were getting what I'm assuming is a significant amount of your time absorbed into the manufacturing process, which is very, very rare for an artist to do to the level you did. Did it get in the way of your music or the band?
No, I don't think so. I had to make a living at the time too. So in a way, this was an opportunity for more of the money that I earned from selling the records to come back to me because I did the printing. The problem that I had was being an artist, I would kind of push it too much and maybe not really get paid enough for the amount of time I put into it. That's always been an issue. And I think that's an issue for a lot of artists. You put a lot of your time and energy and soul into something, and how often does that really come back to you? I mean, I could have made a lot more money if I went and got a corporate job, but I wouldn't have a book if I'd done that.
Oh, believe me, no one's getting rich off podcasting about vinyl records either. I mean, yeah. So let me ask you, were record nerds and collectors at this time already bombarding you with questions about pressings and details and that sort of thing?
Yeah, it took a while before that started happening, but eventually, occasionally I'll get people asking about that. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, I mean, obviously, the more I got into this and making more different variations, it did start to occur to me that there would be collectors wanting to get one of each. And there was a period of time in the late 80s where I think I was probably on the 4th or 5th edition of Tragic Figures. And by that time, I was doing 6 or 7 different color combinations in each edition and running some of the things through upside down and just basically, again, trying to keep myself interested. But we had one guy that would do mail order, and it's like every couple of weeks he would send us like $50 in the mail and say, send me 5 more copies of Tragic Figures. And he probably had 30 or 40 different varieties at one point. So some people do get obsessive, yes.
What was the biggest logistical fuck up? Like, what was the worst nightmare scenario when you were creating this thing that came to pass?
So actually, the Party Boys album, No Aggro, that I released in 1984, that was right after I had set up my own letterpress print shop in downtown LA. So the Party Boys were kind of this art punk band that I had gotten to know their manager, and I actually was in school, had gone to UCLA art school with the bass player Marnie Weber, who's now a pretty well-known conceptual artist in the art world. And so they had recorded this album, and I decided, okay, let's put it out. And that was the one where I conceived of the idea of doing 100 different color combinations. They had given me a full color band photo that they had taken at like a Latino photo shop downtown. So it was one of the first, it wasn't the first time, but it was one of the first times that I had done full color CMYK printing on the letterpress. And I thought, well, what would happen if you printed the yellow plate blue and the black plate red and kind of switched it up? And so I ended up doing this conceptual art project with their album cover. We had 2,000 albums, and we did 20 each of of 100 different color combinations, and we switched the plates around, and it was really a fascinating thing. But I also invited the band members to come in and help print the covers. And of course, that means that there's a lot of covers that are either over inked or off register. We also had to print a solid opaque white ink underneath the photograph on top of the brown chipboard that we were printing on. Mm-hmm. And the registration pin on the press wasn't tight enough. And so we printed like 2,000 of these. And we found out when we started trying to do the second color that the first color wasn't registered, that it would slowly move. So we literally had to flip the paper stock over, tighten that registration pin down, and reprint the whole edition again. Fortunately, it was only the first run, and so all of those album covers, or most of them, have this white print on the inside, which was the failed first run.
All right. Well, you learned to tighten those pins after that, yeah?
We definitely did.
Did you used to review and mine old magazines and designs for ideas?
Occasionally. Yeah, actually, there's a flyer that I made for the Bridge 7-inch that takes an old drawing from a 1940s World War II magazine for a pencil. And it was like, we're using these pencils to create bombs for the war effort. I just thought this is such a weird thing. I'll use it. So
there's pictures of all these in this book, Savage Impressions, which I spent many evenings just flipping through. It's a gorgeous book. I'm sorry I missed. The deluxe edition came with a record, right?
Yes. So we put together a limited edition vinyl album of previously unreleased recordings from boxes in my closet of old cassette tapes from rehearsals and demos and just all sorts of various recordings that at the time, weren't considered worth releasing, or they were just ideas for something we were going to work on later. So anyway, I went back through these and listened and managed to find enough interesting music to put an album together. So
is that the same music that's on the Tape Excavation LP?
Yes, that is the Tape Excavation LP, yeah.
Ah, got it. Okay. And there are copies of that available separately. So I guess people could buy the book and then buy a copy of the record and kind of put them together.
Yeah, we ended up doing a gold vinyl edition that went with the deluxe version. And there's some other letterpress printed ephemera that comes with the deluxe version. But we also did an additional black vinyl version of the Tape Excavation album, just so that people could have it if they just wanted to buy the record.
Okay. And I understand there's a relaunch underway of Independent Project Records. What does that mean to relaunch the label?
Well, I started the label in 1980, so this has been around for 40 years. It was the 1980s and 1990s when I was most active. In the early 2000s, I reached a point where I just felt like I needed to shift my focus more to my design and printing company, because that was really what was supporting me. The record label wasn't. And so there were only a few scattered releases during the 21st century. But once the book came out, I started talking with an old friend of mine, Jeffrey Clark, who was the singer in a band called Shiva Burlesque that I worked with in the late 80s. And he said he was thinking he wanted to start up a reissue label. The more we started talking about it, we realized that it would be good for us to partner in this label. And then we negotiated a new distribution deal with Darla Records. And so we've just relaunched the label in the last couple of months, announced that. We've got a few back catalog items that we're selling now, but we are heavily getting into production on new projects, most of which we're focusing on reissues of music from the 80s and the 90s, although there will be some other things that we are thinking about that are outside of that era. So we're starting the new year, just getting into trying to work close to full time on getting some interesting releases together.
Wow. I'm going to assume that these packages will be of the same sort of quality and care that the 80s and 90s records were known for, yeah?
Yes. That's the idea, is to keep doing the letterpress packaging for both vinyl and CD. And then Darla is also handling digital distribution. So the music will also be available through streaming and downloads. But yeah, for the physical, definitely the idea is to capitalize on what Independent Project is known for, which is to create beautiful artistic records and CDs of music we think is very special.
Now, coming back into this after a decade or two off, what sort of new technologies can you bring into the process that will perhaps help you in the manufacturing end, but not take away from the beauty and the aesthetic of Independent Project records?
Well, it's interesting because there are a few projects that we're working on where the artist, the musicians have like some full color imagery that they want us to use for the package. So the idea is that we're looking at collaborating with a regular album jacket printer to print these full color images and then ship them to us. And then we will do something with the letterpress on top of or around the full color imagery, and then send it off to our die cutter to be die cut into the shapes of our packaging that we're doing. So that's something that's fairly new in terms of how we're planning to approach some of our releases. But I think it's a lot easier now to move audio files around and send them to people in different parts of the country or the world to work on. We're not limited to mastering engineers in Los Angeles necessarily. We have a couple of projects that are being mastered in New York. Things can be moved around quite a bit easier that way.
Okay. But still the same technique in the letterpress, the same approach in making these really on a machine that's probably 100 years old? Yeah.
Very
heavy machine?
Very heavy machine. Not as heavy as a record collection, but very heavy machine.
When the records that I've experienced from Independent Project, they seem to be a full artwork piece, the music and the packaging. Was the intention to have them all elements beholden to the music, or was the music created independently, the visuals created independently and married together later?
Different projects come together in different ways. And over the years, in my various attempts to make a living doing a record label, I entered into manufacturing and distribution deals with several different distributors. And so not everything on Independent Project is done with the letterpress or in the same manner. But I think our goal at this point is to get back to what really makes Independent Project special. And, in all cases, it all starts with the music. We don't want to just work with any music. We only want to work with music that speaks to us or that we really enjoy listening to. I mean, it's interesting because, I started off Independent Project as a way for me to release my own music because I couldn't conceive that anybody else would release it back in 1980. But once I had managed to have a little bit of success with the first Savage Republic album, I looked around at some of the other bands in the Los Angeles area that I was really enjoying. I would go see other bands, or we would do gigs with other bands, and I'd think, wow, these guys should really have an album out. I would buy it. I want one of these in my collection. So that was what led me to approach groups like the Human Hands and Community FK. It was just that there was a desire on my part to have a record of theirs in my collection, and nobody else was doing it. So that was sort of the most pure reason for me starting to release other people's music. And, that's still part of it. It's not that nobody else is doing it. Well, in some cases it is. There are certain projects that we want to do that other people end up doing or that other people want to do. And then there are other things that I can't believe that nobody has tried to reissue a certain band from the 1980s that released one record. And I just thought, wow, this is like some of the best of this genre of music I've ever heard. And it's almost completely unknown, except for the record collectors who happen to have one in their collection. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, one of the main things for all the list of projects that we're considering reissuing is, I want one. Uh-huh. I want this in my collection. I want to be able to hear it. I want to see it happen. And so now I'm fortunate that I'm getting into a situation where I can help make a lot more of that happen.
So we established that you don't throw a lot of things away. Do you have a lot of boxes of the old independent project records, 2 and 3 and 4 or 50 kind of hanging around?
Not as much as I used to. When I was starting out, I kind of pulled aside a couple of copies of each release, and then eventually it got to the point where I would put 5 away or 10 away, and that would sort of be my archives. I have thinned that down a bit just because it just, 40 years later, and you keep accumulating more and more stuff, it takes more space, more time, more energy to deal with it. And so I do still have copies of everything that I've released on the label, anywhere from, say, 3 to 10 copies put away. Mm-hmm. Well, and it's funny because, for a number of years, I had a lot of inventory, a back inventory of things. And there was one period of time, particularly when I did a distribution deal when I was in Los Angeles with a company called the Chameleon Music Group. And they had a distribution deal through Capitol Records. And so the second album from For Against ended up going through Capitol because they thought, okay, there's some possibility for some success here. So they pressed a lot of copies of several different releases that I put through them. Mm-hmm. And when they eventually went out of business, which they did, I ended up getting a lot of this inventory back. And I sat on hundreds of copies of several different releases that I had done in the late 80s for years and just wasn't able to sell them. And there was this album by a British duo called Woo, and the album's called It's Cozy Inside. And I had just sort of found out about their music by accident and written to them because back in those days, in the 80s, people put their addresses on the backs of their records if they put them out themselves. And they offered me to release their second album. And so that was something I was able to push through this Chameleon Music deal. But it didn't sell very well. It's a lovely record. It's just beautiful, instrumental, homegrown, home recorded, very unique sounding stuff. But it just didn't connect with an audience at the time. And so I had tons of copies of this record in vinyl, CD, and cassette. And I just got tired of paying to store it. And I ended up selling it to a cutout dealer back in the 90s. And lo and behold, 15 years later, it's like become this underground thing. And it got reissued by Drag City Records a few years ago. And even the reissues were collectible. And it's like, there are thousands of copies of this album out there. And I had a bunch of them, but I don't have them anymore because I sold them all to a cutout dealer. But yeah, people are still wanting to pay, $50 to $100 for originals of that album.
Yeah. Well, you've got quite a few on your label that are quite collectible. And just going through Discogs and looking at all the different pressings and what people are getting for them. It must be surreal for you to look at what these things are going for and knowing what went into them and remembering the boxes that you had carting around from location to location.
Yeah. There are times where I keep thinking, wish I'd put a few more of those away.
Now, again, in the book, Savage Impressions book, very detailed, lots of beautiful photography of this work in there. People can check that out over at projectroom.net. In the book, you go into some of the relationships you had with the major labels when you were creating this sort of art and aesthetic in the 80s and 90s. It got a lot of attention, especially in Los Angeles, where you were based at. you formulated relationships with the likes of REM, Virgin Records. What were some of the projects that you would have liked to see happen? And what are the ones that were pitched to you that you said, nah, that's not going to work?
I didn't turn down much of anything. I needed the work.
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. You got to pay your bills. And I was really grateful to get the work that I got from the major labels. Even though, there were bands that honestly, I did question it sometimes. Am I selling out, in the sense that, okay, here I had defined this whole aesthetic for my art that I'm doing for music that I love, and now I'm getting hired to do covers for dance music like Scritti Politti. I was thrilled to have the work. It was the biggest job I'd ever had up to that point, and I got to do some really neat, creative things with that. But musically, there was a part of me that was just like, am I like weakening my aesthetic by allowing it to be used for this music? And that was always a question for me. But on the other hand, I needed the work. So, it just sort of encouraged me to, when it was my own music or my own project, to reach further than I would otherwise reach doing it for somebody else.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned that your design work, it garnered a few Grammy nominations.
Yes.
What did that mean to you?
Oh, it was exciting at the time. It was just like, wow, amazing. I got a Grammy nomination. And actually, the second year that I was nominated, I did get to go to the Grammys. But that most of the Grammys are actually awarded very quickly before the whole televised version of it is. And, they just sort of herd you into this one small auditorium, and they run through everything, and then you get to leave, and then the fancy people come in for the televised session. So it kind of took the excitement out of the whole process. But on the other hand, it's an honor to be chosen, and in some ways it's interesting. I got to see how sort of political that whole scene is, and realize that actually getting nominated means that your work is appreciated by your peers, the other designers that get to nominate. And then it's everybody that's in the Academy votes on things. So in some ways, it's just to be nominated is an honor enough,
Mm-hmm. And when you were pressing the records, what record pressing plant were you using?
There were several different pressing plants that I used. There was one called H.V. Waddell Company that was in Burbank that I used for a number of early releases. Then, when I got connected with Chameleon Music Group, they started using one called Record Technology, or RTI, which was one of the most high-end pressing plants on the West Coast. So we had a few things pressed there. There was one that a lot of people use called Rainbow that I tried once, and it was a complete nightmare. And so I never went back. Yeah.
That's a general consensus. Yeah. They're cheap. They got things done, but
in my case, they didn't really get things done.
Okay. And did they have to customize their approach that much to fit into your aesthetic?
Well, there was one thing I was trying to do a lot early on, which was print my own labels on the brown craft paper. Mm-hmm. And that was problematic for some of the pressing plants. If the pressing plants had automated presses, the brown craft paper wouldn't work because it was too porous. And so it would suck up more than one label at a time and try to put them on the record. So actually, the main pressing plant I started using there in the late 80s was a place called Alberti Record Pressing, which is been out of business for decades now. But they had all hand-fed record presses, and so they could handle those brown craft labels. I also had to hire, there was a guy in sort of East Hollywood area, I think they were G&M Printing, that printed a lot of labels, record labels for records. And so I would take my labels that I printed on the letterpress to him, and he would die cut them into the label shape for the different pressing plants to use. So, and then early on, before I started die cutting my own design covers, I had to find somebody that would take my letterpress printed flat album jackets and actually fabricate them into album sleeves. And so there was a place in Burbank called Modern Album who printed a lot of album jackets for the industry at the time. But I would bring my letterpress printed flats in, and they would run them through their machine to fabricate them into album jackets. So, all the early Savage Republic and Human Hands and Party Boys album jackets were manufactured there.
Bruce, again, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing all those stories and tales and details. I think we went right to the right level of nerddom
Good.
in this whole process. I do want to encourage people to check out the book Savage Impressions. You can go to independentprojectrecords.bandcamp.com. You could pick up a copy there along with a lot of the other Independent Project Records releases. And of course, follow them there and on Facebook so you hear about all the new reissues and re-releases that the label's going to start doing. There's also an LP tape excavation. There's a 200, I believe they're numbered copies. I would imagine they're numbered copies, but 200 at projectroom.net. Of course, you can go to independentprojectrecords.com and check out what's in the shop there. And again, Bruce, thank you so much for coming on the show, and we look forward to seeing what you get up to next.
Thanks very much, Nate. I really appreciate it.
All right, there he is, the legend himself, Mr. Bruce Licher of Independent Project Records. Again, you could read all about the story of Independent Project Records in this beautiful, absolutely gorgeous book, Savage Impressions, an aesthetic expedition through the archives of Independent Project Records and Press, available at ipparchive.com. And of course, check out independentprojectrecords.bandcamp.com. They're relaunching the label, and they've kicked it off with this fantastic compilation called Tape Excavation, limited vinyl available, again, at independentprojectrecords.bandcamp.com. And that is it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please share these episodes on your social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. That's a huge help to us. Also, if you can jump on to Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you get these podcasts on, give The Vinyl Guide a great review. 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10 stars, whatever you got. Give us the goodness, and we certainly do appreciate it. We'll be back shortly with a brand new episode. So until we talk next time, keep spinning. Cheers.
That's it for this episode of The Vinyl Guide. Send your thoughts to Nate at thevinylguide.com or follow or tag us on Instagram at Vinyl Guide. Until next time, keep spinning.